Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Phillips, and this is my final project video presentation for Communication 510. For our final research project, the question that I chose to answer, to explore, was why do millennials hate being labeled? So right now within the status quo, there's a great deal of research that suggests millennials just don't like being labeled. Strong dislike against labels about personalities, groups, things like that. One of the more compelling one of the more compelling studies that I found was done by Pew Research Group, and it found that aside from the silent generation, who members of the silent generation typically identify as either the greatest generation that ever lived, the World War II generation, or they identify more as the baby boomer generation. Not very many people consider themselves to have fallen within the time frame of the silent generation. But besides members of the silent generation, millennials are the least likely demographic group to identify with their generational label. Approximately only 40% of millennials will actually identify with that term, whereas baby boomers, Gen Xers, the numbers are closer to 60 and 70%. So millennials very much dislike being labeled, but none of the research out there really addresses why that's the case. If anything, it only addresses through proxy, using certain demographic descriptives as sort of a way of answering the question. So we found that a majority of millennials have had this many jobs, and they expect to make this much money. And when they don't make that much money, they usually work at this place for this amount of time before they switch jobs. And so research groups have compiled a lot of different forms of demographic research and ultimately use that to answer through proxy why millennials dislike being labeled, but there was nothing that actually addressed the question head on. And so that's what I attempted to do with my research project. And the framework that I used for this project was cultivation theory. Now, cultivation theory states that individuals craft reality based on the media that they consume. So the media that they consume can be from different mediums, but the medium is equally important. So watching a television program, which in 1979, that's what this research was predicated on, the potential dangers that could come from watching violence on television and how that could impact an individual. That's what cultivation theory essentially believes, is that the media that we consume will affect our reality more so than our own personal experiences and beliefs. Now, I felt that cultivation theory was an appropriate framework because the millennial generation is the first generation to grow up entirely with the internet, entirely with cell phones, entirely with computers. And so using cultivation theory seemed like a very good framework to kind of address on more of a micro level basis how millennials are thinking, why millennials are thinking the way that they are, and what is bothering them particularly about labels, and looking to see possibly how the internet and media consumption played a role in that. Some of the literature that I examined prior to my research really dealt with the academic view of millennials right now in the status quo. So just to give you an idea, academia has really kind of become obsessed with studying millennials and understanding the millennial generation as a whole. A simple search on LexisNexis, for example, will produce 999 results if you just type in the two words millennial marketing. Now, of those 998 results, 93%, or approximately 930 of those articles, have been published since 2010. Contrast that with Gen X marketing. So if you were to type in Gen X marketing, you will also come across 998 results. However, only 43% of those 998 results have been published since 2010. So we can see that there's a growing trend within academia to really explore millennials and to explore in particular how to market to millennials. So a lot of the research that I came across dealt specifically with that. How does this brand, how does this company best market to the millennial generation, which is composed of 75 million people born between the years of 1980 and 2000. Now, in a lot of the articles that I found dealing with millennials and marketing, typically there was always a goal to categorize or label millennials in bullet points. So it's either 3 tips and tricks or 3 things you should know about reaching out to a millennial, or 6 character traits that best define a millennial. And that was the majority of the research that I found until I came across a book by a woman named Krista Soltis Anderson. She is a pollster in Washington, D.C. She's popular on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC as a political contributor, and she's also sort of an expert regarding millennials. She was a fellow at the Kennedy School of Politics, which is Harvard School for Politics, and she is very widely recognized as someone who is sort of an expert on millennials. And she recently wrote a book titled The Selfie Vote, which completely chronicles millennials, and it's a partisan book. The book looks at how Republicans should approach millennials in terms of winning them over as voters. But one thing that I found really interesting is that the book gives a predominantly positive yet ambiguous view of millennials. So the book uses words like adventurous, independent, daring, and phrases like supporting the little guy to describe millennials. Now, that was contrary to all of the academic research that I had found through journals and things like that online, specifically dealing with marketing to millennials. The words and phrases that they used within academia were things such as millennials are impatient yet optimistic, and millennials have close parental ties but are eager to be independent. And they were kind of oddly specific words, I felt like, to describe an entire generation. To me, it was pretty clear that to say that millennials, people born between the years 1980 and 2000, are impatient or even optimistic, even though it's a positive term, is a lot more specific than saying they're adventurous, or they're caring, or they're independent. And so, kind of using what I gained from reading Krista Soltis Anderson's book, I developed my hypothesis that millennials don't dislike being labeled altogether. What they dislike are constrictive labels. And so that ultimately led me to my research, my hard research, basically, which was a questionnaire that I composed of some quantitative and some qualitative questions, which produced results that were a lot different than what I had expected. So obviously my hypothesis being that millennials preferred open-ended labels, that's not ultimately what my research proved. What my research found was that it's not that millennials like or dislike a certain type of label, so constrictive versus ambiguous. It's that millennials ultimately dislike labels that are defining, and they don't mind labels that are descriptive. So when I say that labels are descriptive, what I'm referencing is saying that a millennial is someone who was born between the years 1980 and 2000 doesn't really bother millennials. Saying that a millennial is someone who is impatient, independent, optimistic, and all these other different traits is bothersome to millennials. What's bothersome to millennials is when there are TED Talks and lectures being given on how to understand millennials as opposed to just actually understanding them. And some of the best ways that I found this out were through the qualitative aspects of my research. I had one question where I provided everyone who took the survey, which ultimately ended up being 40 respondents, a chart that was a click chart, and it was a flow chart that had all these different clicks within a social setting, looking at predominantly high school. And it had different arrows showing that if you hung out with this group, you were likely to be friends with this group, and if you hung out in this group, this is likely where you were to end up. And I got a lot of really interesting responses to that flow chart. But one of the predominant themes that I came across was this idea that that click chart may be a good reflection of society, but it's not a good reflection of my experiences. And a lot of people were writing in short answers where they would say things such as, when I was in high school, I could have fit into 4 of these different groups. And so I don't really feel like this is a good description of what I went through. And that ultimately struck me as kind of being an indicator that millennials don't feel like they can really be contained to just simple labels that we would think of within the status quo. So ultimately, the conclusion that I arrive at is that my data was rather inconsistent, but I do think that my hypothesis was disproven, at least in part. I don't think, like I said, that millennials necessarily like or dislike all labels. I think that millennials don't really care to be defined. They don't mind being described, but they really don't like being defined. And that kind of is what I think the approach should be for research moving forward, particularly when you consider the fact that in 1991 we labeled millennials, and half of that demographic, or half of the group that composed that demographic, wasn't even born at that point. Millennials are the first generation to grow up their entire lives with a label. And so the fact that there's been this negative response to these labels somehow is an indicator that there is a predisposition for this negative attitudinal response among millennials towards labels, when in reality is we don't have anything else to compare this to, because like I said, 1991 we started labeling millennials. The oldest millennial in 1991 was 12 years old, and that individual was already growing up with a label. So that's something that I think researchers should keep in mind moving forward. If we want to use labels to describe individuals, that's great, but not necessarily to define them. And I think that cultivation theory was a really important framework for me to use here, because since millennials are growing up with the internet, they have access to a lot more research and are composing ideas and are getting information from just a massive, massive pool of resources. And I think that that will ultimately show in the research that I concluded that millennials feel like they belong to different groups and different labels. So that's everything I have regarding my paper. Thank you guys all very much for an incredible 8 weeks, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next course. Take care.